There were some signs of a thaw in the Cold War in early June as Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, banning land-based ballistic and cruise missiles in the medium-range category. Small steps, but it would still see the elimination of some 2,700 nuclear missiles by 1991. While in Moscow for the summit, President Reagan also made a speech to 600 students at Moscow State University, making for a striking visual as he stood beneath an enormous bust of Lenin. After the usual platitudes about peace and goodwill between nations and speaking about the microchip revolution, he devoted much of his speech to extolling the virtues of personal freedom in the US and encouraging the Soviet Union's people to push for more change themselves. Over in the Soviet Republic of Estonia, the Tartu Pop Festival took place, in which singer Ivo Linna and songwriter Alu Matisen premiered their 5 patriotic songs series, which proved hugely popular, and a few days later in Tallinn, attendees at the Old Town Festival started singing the songs and decamped en masse to the nearby festival grounds with no interference from the authorities. On both occasions, the pre-Soviet Estonian tricolour flag of black, blue and white was flown instead of the official flag of the Estonian SSR. And in West Germany, the European Football Championships kicked off. Unlike in 1974, when the country had hosted the World Cup, the West German Football Association had decided not to host any matches in West Berlin, in deference to the political sensibilities of the Soviet bloc, who refused to recognise the city as part of the Federal Republic. 8 teams had qualified, with a number of surprising absentees, including 1986 World Cup semi-finalists France and Belgium, and 1984 European semi-finalist Portugal. The Republic of Ireland would make their first appearance at an international tournament and were somewhat inevitably placed in a group with England. The first matches took place on the weekend of the Canadian Grand Prix, with hot favourites West Germany and Italy settling for a 1-1 draw, and Spain beating Denmark 3-2 in a lively encounter. There were 2 surprising results in Group 2, though, as Ireland took an early lead against England and then held on for a 1-0 win. It would later emerge that England's star striker Gary Lineker was suffering from hepatitis B, which was slowing him down a bit. In the other game, the Soviets likewise beat the highly fancied Dutch, who were wearing a very striking kit, 1-0, with a goal from Ukrainian midfielder Vasil Rats just after half-time. The Formula One teams meanwhile headed north to Canada, returning after a sponsorship-induced year's absence. The circuit owners had used the opportunity to rejig things a bit, building a new pit lane and paddock at the opposite end of the circuit and moving the start-finish line to the Épingle de l'Île end, and reprofiling a couple of corners to accommodate. But it was still expected to be the same fast, fuel-guzzling circuit that would benefit the turbo cars if they were careful with their fuel consumption. And the mechanics of various teams were still able to lash together rafts from spare bits and pieces and have a race across the Olympic rowing lake, around which the circuit is built. Incidentally, I've not been able to find out when this tradition began. Do let me know in the comments if you know, but it was a popular fixture of the Canadian Grand Prix weekend for many years to come. The cars occupying the new paddock would be pretty much the same as in Mexico 2 weeks ago, though there had been news that Renault would be returning to Formula One in 1989 and would be building a new V10 engine for the Williams team. But Mansell, yet to score a point this year, had been dropping hints that he might be moving on for 1989, with Ferrari and Benetton spoken of as possible destinations. For this year, though, the talk was all about McLaren, who had taken the pole position and won every race so far. Some were loudly hoping for a change at the top. Prost sympathised, but pointed out that our job is to win. You can hardly expect us to slow down to stop people getting bored. Ken Tyrrell, meanwhile, told Barry Gill on the US coverage that he was confident that his team could do well and that a non-turbo team could win here.
Ken, can we expect anything from those cars today?
Oh, I think we're going to see perhaps the most exciting race of the year here, because the turbos are in some difficulty with fuel consumption, so I think that maybe for the only time this year a non-turbo car can actually win a Grand Prix.
I mean, you are starting from a long way down the grid. What about the hopes for your own team?
Well, you know what, there was a famous Australian who said, to finish first, you first have to finish. And our first target is to get round that first bend without getting involved with Alio, who is notorious for writing everybody off on the first lap.
You do realise we have a lot of French listeners.
Prost had never actually won a race in North America, and his new teammate would be hoping to continue that streak by taking the win and closing up in the championship standings. He certainly set out his stall early, taking his 5th pole in 5 races, with Prost once again alongside. Then Berger and Alboreto in the Ferraris, on row 2. Sandro Nannini lined up 5th, to the delight of Luciano Benetton in the stands, but was 2.2 seconds off Senna, alongside Piquet, with Boutsen and Cheever making up row 4. Nigel Mansell was 9th in the atmospheric Williams, with Philippe Streff an impressive 10th, the best for both driver and team. Stefano Modena made it through PQ without being disqualified this time, and lined up a very encouraging 15th just ahead of Derek Warwick, who'd had quite a shunt in his arrows but was past fit to race despite some lurid bruising. Both Ligiers and both Tyrrells were back on the grid too, with Johansson just scraping in 25th ahead of Tarquini, bringing up the rear in the Coloni. Missing out were Campos, Larini, Dalmas and Schneider, all over 6 seconds off Senna's pole time. Ayrton himself was busy telling anyone who would listen in the lead up to the race that being on pole actually presented a disadvantage here, as the other side of the grid had a better line into turn 1, but the officials pointed out that he hadn't actually said anything before getting pole, and it was a bit late to change now. So everyone lined up on a warm breezy day in Montreal, with the Honda engineers recommending their teams to keep the boost down to 2.3 bar and not exceed 11,000 RPM, of an available 13,000, to ensure there would be enough fuel to finish. The lights went green, and everyone got away well, with Prost seemingly validating Senna's complaints by taking the lead into turn 1 as the cameras followed the tail enders off the grid. They were followed by the Ferraris and Benettons in formation, then Piquet and Mansell. Very quickly the McLarens and Berger began to pull away from Alboreto and the Benettons, as Julian Bailey toured in, having clobbered Sellers Minardi and broken his suspension. Lewis came in to have a new rear wing fitted, but got going again. There were 3 races developing, Berger hanging on to the leading McLarens, Boutsen and Nannini swarming all over the back of Alboreto's Ferrari, and Mansell and Piquet renewing old acquaintances in the less familiar positions of 7th and 8th, the normally aspirated Williams proving the equal to the turbocharged Lotus around the twists and bends of the track. After 7 or 8 laps hanging on Senna's tail, Berger got a message telling him that he was going to run out of fuel if he kept up that speed, so he backed off and would just have to cling to the rather faint hope that the McLarens would either break down or run out of fuel, and he would probably be very mindful of that rogue fuel light that had halted his charge in Mexico. Larrauri came in to retire a noseless Eurobrunn, having wiped it off on Stefan Johansson's rear wheel, but by now Senna, freed of having to keep an eye on Berger in his mirrors, was right up with Prost, and a great battle for the lead was developing. While the cameras watched that, both Benettons got past Alboreto when he ran wide, and were now bearing down on Berger. A seething Austrian, still obeying team instructions to back off and conserve fuel, watched first Boutsen and then Nannini, loaded down with all the fuel they could carry, some 215 litres to Berger's 150 at the start of the race, swarm past within a couple of corners. Those who had before the race suggested that the Benettons might do a good job here were watching eagerly as they left Berger in their wake and set off in pursuit of the McLarens, some 6 to 7 seconds ahead at this point. Nannini's pursuit didn't last long. A split hose leaked fuel over the inside of his car, which remarkably didn't catch fire but did short out his electrics, so Boutsen was now freed of his upstart teammate in his mirrors and could concentrate on his own race. The leaders were by now already encountering the first backmarkers, with Salas now repaired Minardi next, while the Piquet-Mansell battle, now over the last point, continued to be a lively affair, with Piquet seemingly holding Mansell up, and Streff's AGS in Nigel's mirrors keeping a watching brief and hoping for the 2 old rivals to take each other off. Back at the front, so to speak, Prost and Senna both passed Sala on lap 19, but Senna carried a bit more speed into the hairpin, braked really late and snuck into the lead ahead of Prost. It was the first time all season that one McLaren had overtaken the other one on track, and immediately began to pull away, keen once more to show himself to be the future of the McLaren team and of F1, and Prost as the man of the past. So, at about a third distance, it was Senna, a second ahead of Prost, who was in turn 6 seconds ahead of Boutsen, another 10 back to Berger, with Alboreto 5th, and the Piquet-Mansell Streff scrap in 6th, 7th and 8th, until the AGS dropped off the pair of them on lap 23. Just then, Berger pulled over with electrical gremlins. It turned out that an incorrect control chip had been fitted, and while the cameras were watching Senna lap his old housemate Gugelmin, Mansell squeezed past Piquet at the hairpin to take what had just become 5th place. Senna was quicker through the traffic than Prost, and was able to extend his lead a little to about 4 seconds as the race headed towards half-distance. Cheever and Warwick were again having a fine private scrap in the midfield as the leaders came round to lap them, and Senna again barged through while Prost was more circumspect. Last year's winner Mansell's fine work was undone with another Judd engine failure on lap 29, by which time Streff had solved whatever was wrong with his car and was now on Piquet's tail, with De Cesaris' Real in the background and closing in. Warwick had a close call in traffic when Tarquini spun right in front of him at the hairpin, and had further good luck when Cheever broke down in front of him with a broken throttle. De Cesaris had by now caught Streff, who was still clambering all over the back of Piquet's Lotus, and Italians Alboreto and Patrese had synchronised engine failures, which promoted Piquet to 4th, Streff to 5th and De Cesaris to 6th. Ahead of them, Boutsen was ploughing a lonely furrow up in 3rd as he lapped 10th-placed Palmer, and Arnoux came in to retire his Ligier before having a bit of a chat with Johansson, who was already out on the pit wall. Philippe Streff's great drive came to an untimely end on lap 42 as his rear suspension gave way, fortunately in such a way as to allow him to steer his wobbling AGS into the pits, so De Cesaris was now up to 5th in the Real, and Ivan Capelli was promoted to 6th in the Aqua Blue March. The McLarens lapped Piquet as they entered the last 15 laps and then lapped Nakajima for the 3rd time, more proof that something was deeply wrong at Lotus. The McLaren team held out a sign for Senna nearly 10 seconds ahead at this point, showing -1, which was interpreted to mean he might come up short on fuel, and then followed it up with another sign saying easy. Prost had already backed off by this point, so Senna was able to obey his team instructions and ease off to clock off the last few laps. Modena lost a potential 8th place finish when he pitted for repairs, and Andrea De Cesaris heartbreakingly ran out of fuel off camera with just 2 laps to go, but Senna had no problems as he came home to win in Canada, with Prost just under 6 seconds behind at the end. Both McLarens pulled immediately over, marginal on fuel and wanting to ensure they weren't finishing underweight, as Boutsen came home a lonely 3rd, and the 3 walked back to the paddock together. The 2 Loti finished in formation, Piquet 4th and Nakajima 11th and 3 laps down. Ivan Capelli took 5th, and Jonathan Palmer a slightly surprised 6th. His drink bottle had come away from its moorings partway through the race and been rattling around in the cockpit, only a miracle preventing it from getting wedged under one of his pedals. Thierry Boutsen's 3rd place was the first time a normally aspirated car had finished on the podium, legally, since John Watson in the McLaren Ford at Zandvoort in 1983, but all eyes were once more on the McLaren duo. Prost may be 2nd here today, but he maintained his handy lead in the title race, while Senna reclaimed 2nd place in the standings from the unfortunate Berger.